Hi guys, welcome back. So if you've seen my other two videos on George Orwell's Animal Farm and Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle, you're probably expecting another textual analysis. I'm here to tell you that this video is not that. Well, sort of at least. Before we get started, a quick note for those of you watching at home. Sometimes I tend to speak quickly, and often that means you don't get a chance to read everything on the slide. Don't worry, because I designed these presentations so that you don't ever have to. But if you're just thorough like that, and you like to cross every T and dot every I, then feel free to pause the video at any point and catch up on any and everything you missed. Now let's get started. Adolf Hitler was obviously the worst kind of guy. In fact, I'm pretty sure one of the Urban Dictionary definitions for the word evil is Hitler. So how did he convince an entire country, an entire people, to follow him? What made millions of people turn a blind eye to reality and follow evil itself? Let's find out. Now before we look at Hitler himself, let's consider his inspiration. Seldom known to most, Hitler's unparalleled ability to captivate and control a crowd emanates from the work of a man named Gustave Le Bon. Le Bon is best known for his work in the psychology of groups, and in particular is acclaimed for his book, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. The Crowd is an amazing book to anyone who's looking to learn how to influence a group, and I recommend it to anyone with some spare time on their hands. In the meantime, I'll SparkNotes it for you. There are three main ideas from The Crowd that I'd like you to keep in mind for this presentation. The first is that an individual in a crowd acquires a sense of power free of restraint and responsibility through a feeling of anonymity. Without anonymity, there can be no crowd. After that, the feeling of anonymity spreads like wildfire to everyone in the developing crowd. This feeling infects everyone and unites them under the same feeling. And lastly, the group's combined excitement and support for a certain idea, no matter how unthinkable, is accepted and pursued. This idea is characterized as suggestibility. This layout is how a crowd develops. Some get lost in a crowd and disappear into the background. Then the feeling spreads everywhere. The only thing left is for an idea to be suggested. That, in fact, is the leader's job. It really makes no difference how insane the suggestion is, as long as it is supported by a general interest from the public. So the only thing the leader ever has to determine is what he or she wants to suggest. Before we move on, I want to include a few other components to this presentation. First, that Le Bon characterizes a crowd as having a collective unconscious that develops thoughts and makes decisions as a single unit. The second comes from Gidding's analysis of Le Bon's The Crowd. Gidding emphasizes the importance of images and imagination for a crowd. Driven by what they see, not necessarily what makes sense, crowds are a lot like children, according to Gidding. Like children, crowds are impatient and intolerant of discussion and delay of any kind. This, of course, makes perfect sense if we consider the ideas Hitler suggested to his crowds and how much logic was actually behind the ideas themselves. Any discussion or debate on the subject would no doubt lead nowhere and would most likely result in violence, because the counterargument to a claim against genocide is relatively non-existent. So we've considered where Hitler got his ideas from. Now let's consider how he used them to his advantage. On a general level, and this applies to more than just crowd control, Hitler knew that he had no equal in the art of swaying the masses. In other words, he was ultra-confident in his own ability and did not question himself. But far more importantly, the way he used language was his greatest weapon. In terms of what he said, Hitler managed in each of his speeches to unify the group into a crowd, identify and inflate a general threat to the group, in Hitler's case the Jews, and to invoke a higher power like God in support of the abolition of the threat, and himself as the agent of that higher power. Now, how he said it? Simplicity is essential. Strategically choosing the complexity of diction and use of stereotypes allowed Hitler to assert ideas onto the members of the crowds in a way that is easy for everyone to understand and accept. Emotion is also key. Speaking with a passion allowed Hitler to become one of the crowd. Repetition, ironically enough, is probably the one you're most familiar with. The popular saying, Heil Hitler, was repeated so many times throughout the mid-20th century, it was basically engraved in the minds of those who grew up hearing it, or hearing of it. But the bigger question with this presentation is, where am I going with this? Hitler and his ability to manipulate crowds is of course a fascinating study, but a little outdated, don't you think? Let's consider something more modern. Let's ask ourselves, does someone like Donald Trump demonstrate the same power of manipulation that Hitler did? What kinds of things do they have in common with regard to their ability to influence groups of people? Let's have a look. Here's a list of similarities we considered a minute ago. I won't go through each of these individually in great depth, but it is obvious that Trump unifies behind a commonality, like immigration, and identifies and inflates threats to the group. On the matter of a higher power, Trump is not as religiously reliant as Hitler was, but the level of nationalism associated with his campaign is, in and of itself, a higher power of sorts. Simplicity is particularly an interesting issue. Nerdwriter on YouTube does a fantastic job expanding on Trump's strategic use of simplicity in case you want to know even more about the way he speaks. I won't go as in-depth as him, but I will note that the Globe did a study on all of the presidential candidates a few months ago and came to the conclusion that Donald Trump speaks at a fourth grade level of complexity, the lowest of any of the candidates. His words seldom extend beyond the second syllable, and the use of assertion, repetition, emotion, and stereotypes is borderline exhausting. So we'll give some checks to those areas as well. You look at the overall results, and they're interesting to say the least. The question really that we need to ask then, is Trump the next Hitler? Will he be the next Hitler? Let me start by saying that my goal with these videos is to take an objective approach to these topics. I did not approach this topic with the intention to impose my political views on you guys. However, regardless, the question holds substantial merit. How do we know what Trump's true intentions are? How do we know whether we're being manipulated right now? The truth is, we don't. Our job is not to condemn someone who has not done anything wrong yet. Rather, our job is to tread with caution and to be ready to respond and to resist if something does happen. So be careful. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.